Aging Prospector waited at the mountain pass. Wolf followed a bride to his fire. The mule was the first thing that told me something was wrong. She'd been standing easy all morning, one hip dropped, ears lazy. Then about midday she lifted her head and held it, nostrils working, eyes gone flat and wide the way they get when a smell comes from uphill. I set down the pick and looked north along the tree line, nothing moving, but I'd learned not to argue with that mule. I'd been at the pass since the first week of September, alone since August if you count the weeks before I came up. Before that, Gideon Marsh, my partner of 11 years, had gone and died on me down in Sacramento of something that started as a cough. 11 years. We'd worked every crease in the Sierra Nevada together, and then one spring morning I was alone. I came up to the Truckee Pass not because I expected to find color. I'd been up twice before and hadn't. I came because I didn't know what else to do with myself. A man alone in a city is a different kind of alone than a man alone in mountains. Mountains at least don't pretend to give a damn about you. I'd made a decent camp. Rock windbreak on 3 sides, pine boughs cut and laid thick, a fire pit that drew clean when the wind shifted west. I had enough meal and salt pork to last past first snowfall and a rifle that hadn't misfired in 4 years. I wasn't comfortable. Comfortable is for towns, but I was settled, the kind of settled that comes from having nothing left to prove. The mule hadn't put her head down. I picked up the rifle. They came through the gap just before 3 o'clock, what was left of them. 2 wagons, one with a cracked wheel rim that was grinding on the iron and throwing sparks every time it rolled over gravel. A man driving the lead wagon with one arm wrapped in dirty cloth and his face the color of old ash. 3 children on the tailgate of the second wagon, not talking, just watching the ground go under them with the empty eyes that come from too many days of hard going. A woman walking alongside the second wagon because the oxen were laboring. She was the one I noticed first, if I'm honest. Not for the reason a younger man might. She walked like someone who had decided some days back that she was going to walk no matter what. That deliberate, that stubborn. Her dress was ruined, caked mud to the knee, the hem torn and pinned up with what looked like a harness buckle. She had dark hair coming loose from a braid, and she was looking at the animals, not the trail, because she was watching their feet for signs of lameness. That's a woman who knows what she's doing, I thought. That's not a person who got on a wagon because her husband told her to. I came down from the rocks and she was the first one who saw me. Didn't startle, just stopped walking and put her hand on the wagon board and looked at me straight. "You know this pass," she said. "Better than most," I said. "There's a man following us, 2 days back, maybe 3. He killed our scout and took his horse, and he's been staying just out of rifle range ever since." She said it the way you'd report the weather. No trembling in it. But I could see in the set of her jaw that she'd been carrying that fact for 2 or 3 days and hadn't let herself fall apart over it, and the effort of that was showing around her eyes. "How many?" I said. "One we've seen, maybe 2. I looked at the injured man on the lead wagon. He'd stopped the team and was watching me with the kind of careful attention that a man gives to a stranger when he's in no shape to defend himself and knows it. "Your husband," I said. "My brother," she said. "His name is Cal, mine is Martha Holt." I told her mine. She nodded like she was filing it. "Can you make it another 1/4 mile?" I said. "There's a flat above the switchback with good sight lines north and west. Wood and water. Your animals need to stop." She didn't ask me if I was trustworthy. She didn't look me over for longer than a second. She just turned and said something to the children on the tailgate and then walked back to her spot beside the lead ox and clicked her tongue at him. I remember thinking, she's either the most trusting woman alive or she's the best judge of people I've ever met. I found out later it was the second one. I'm going to tell you about the man who'd been following them, because you need to understand what kind of thing it was. His name, when we eventually learned it, was Dowd. He'd been with their wagon company out of St. Joseph, and had been put out of it somewhere in Nebraska for reasons that Cal Holt, when he was well enough to talk, would only describe as conduct toward women. He'd ridden ahead, waited, and then drifted back to follow when the company split at the fork near Fort Hall. He'd figured, correctly, that a single wagon with a wounded man and children would be easier to manage by the time they reached the pass. That is the kind of calculation that a certain kind of man makes. I had met a few of them in my years in these mountains. They are not usually brave. They are patient, which is different. I did not tell Martha Holt any of this that first night. She had enough to carry. The camp I'd made was good, but it had only been built for one. We spent the last 2 hours of light making it right for 7, the 3 children, Cal Holt, a teenage boy named Thomas who turned out to be Cal's son from a first wife, Martha, and me. I cut more boughs. Martha took over the fire without asking and had the salt pork going in a pan before I'd finished banking the windbreak, and she moved around the camp like she'd cooked in worse conditions than this, which she probably had. The children ate like they hadn't properly eaten in a week. Cal Holt tried to sit up and help and couldn't. I told him to lie still. He didn't like it, but he did it. Martha caught my eye from across the fire and gave me a small nod, just a small one. That night I sat on the north side of camp with a rifle across my knees and didn't sleep. It was cold, not killing cold, but the kind of cold that gets in under your coat and stays. I fed the fire just enough to keep it from going dark without making it a beacon. Around 3 in the morning I heard the mule go tense again. Not movement, not sound, just that stillness she gets. I put my hand on the rifle and waited. Nothing came, but something had been close. I found the boot prints in the morning in the soft soil at the edge of the tree line. He'd come to within 200 yards and turned back. Maybe he'd seen the fire was maintained. Maybe he'd counted shadows. I didn't say anything about the prints to Martha until after the children had gone to gather wood. She looked at them for a long moment. "How close do you think he'll come?" "Depends how patient he is," I said. "And how badly he wants to." She said, "I won't let him near those children." There was no heat in it. It was just a fact she was stating. I believed her completely. "Neither will I said. She looked at me then, really looked, the way she'd looked when I came down off the rocks. Measuring, not suspicious, just honest. "You've been alone up here a long time," she said. "Since September. Before that, Sacramento, my partner died." She didn't say she was sorry, which I appreciated. She said, "You know these mountains." "I do." "Then we're fortunate," she said. She said it plainly, without flattery in it, and went back to the fire. I stood there for a moment with the boot prints at my feet and thought about that word. Fortunate. I hadn't thought of myself as fortune to anyone in a long time. He came on the 3rd night. Not quietly. I think by then he'd decided patience wasn't working, that I wasn't going anywhere, that the weather was turning, and that he needed to move. He came in from the east, where the rock face drops off, because he'd figured that was the side I'd be watching least. He figured wrong. The mule is on the east side. She brayed once, that flat, alarmed bray that cuts right through sleep, and I was already moving. I had him in the moonlight before he was 20 yards into camp. He had a pistol, and I had the rifle, and those are 2 different conversations at that range. I told him so. He stood with the pistol at his side and thought about it for longer than I liked. Thomas, the teenage boy, had come out of the wagon with a hatchet. He planted himself on the south side without anyone telling him to. 15 years old. I thought, that boy will be fine. Martha came out last, with a skinning knife. She stood near Cal, who was propped against the wagon wheel with a long-barreled pistol he'd apparently had under his blanket the whole time. Dowd looked around at all of us, and then looked at me. "Ride out," I said. "Right now, tonight, your horse and your life. You come back, you don't get the second one." He thought about it another moment. Then he turned and walked back into the dark. I kept watch until first light. He didn't come back. Cal Holt's arm healed crooked. The bone had set wrong before I could do anything about it, which is a shame, but he could use the hand. By the time the weather broke, they were in good enough shape to move. The wagons were patched. The oxen had rested. I'd traded 2 of my mules to Cal for fair value because his second ox had gone lame and wouldn't recover, and 2 mules in harness will move a wagon well enough if you're patient with them. The morning they were getting ready to go, Martha came to where I was standing by the fire pit. I was breaking camp, putting it back the way I found it, more or less, which is a habit. "Come with us," she said. I looked at her. "We're going to the valley near Fort Vancouver," she said. "Cal has a land grant. There's room and there's work, and there's no reason to be alone in these mountains all winter." I said something about the claim. She said, "Is there gold in it?" "Not much," I said. "Then there's no reason." She wasn't pushing. She wasn't performing kindness. She was just telling me a true thing the same way she'd told me about the man following them, directly, without excess. I looked at the mountains. I had come up here because I didn't know what to do with myself. That was the honest reason. And somewhere in the last 2 weeks I'd started to feel like a man who knew what he was doing again, not because anything had changed in me, but because someone had needed what I had, and I'd had enough of it to give. "I'll think on it," I said. She nodded and went back to check the rigging on the lead wagon. She didn't press me. She didn't look back to see if I was watching. I was. We pulled out that afternoon, all of us. I came last, leading the pack mule, and I took one look back at the camp. The rock windbreak, the fire pit cold now, the place where I'd spent the last weeks being nobody to anybody. Thomas rode up beside me on the roan I'd loaned him. He didn't say anything. 15 years old, and he'd stood with a hatchet in the dark without being asked. I thought about Gideon, 11 years, and how a partnership is built from those moments, not from words, but from what a person does when it counts. I thought maybe that's not done for me yet. It was 2 days down the west side of the pass before Martha said anything else about it. We'd stopped to rest the animals near a creek, and she was sitting on the wagon tongue doing something with a piece of harness leather. I came and sat near the fire, and we didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "My husband died in the spring, fever." "I know," I said, "Cal had told me." "He was a good man," she paused, "but not this kind of country." I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that wouldn't be wrong. She looked up from the leather. "You are," she said, "this kind of country." It was the plainest thing anyone had said to me in a long time. Maybe in years, not flattery, just recognition. She'd seen what I was and named it like it was a fact worth stating. I felt something shift, the way a stone shifts when the ground under it finally settles after a long time of being unsettled. "I'm old," I said, "because I am." "So am I," she said, which wasn't quite true. She was younger than me by a ways, but I understood what she meant. She wasn't talking about years. The fire popped. The creek ran. The mules were drinking downstream with their ears back and lazy, and the children were asleep in the wagon, and the mountains we'd come through were behind us now, catching the last of the light. She went back to the harness. I went back to the fire. But she'd moved closer, just a little. And we sat there in the cooling air, and I thought about Fort Vancouver and the land grant and Cal's arm that had set crooked, and the teenage boy who'd stood with a hatchet, and all the things that needed doing when you got to a place, and tried to make something out of it. A man needs to be needed. That's not a weakness, that's just true. I watched the fire settle down to coals, and I didn't feel like a man who had nothing left.